Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to get you to be excited about measurement, and I really do think my panel might be excited. And I'm starting because if you look at the literature, and I don't think any of us want to make this statement, after-school programs might matter, but they don't look so good if you look overall. And that's not a very good story to tell. And so I'm going to start, I really look at involvement and engagement, and that's the first level, and I'm going to want to show you why. And let's see if I can actually do, oh, I can, okay. The most common way that we're thinking about involvement in a program is attendance. You know, we check off yes and no if they're there. I want to argue there's a lot of reasons why that's important. Don't not take attendance, but we have to move beyond. I mean, clearly, we need to know how many kids are coming, which types of kids are coming for staffing, and, you know, grants require this kind of data. So I'm not saying don't do it, but it's a really, you know, limited measure. Okay. What's the problems with just thinking about attendance? Well, we are saying that a kid who comes every day is really invested in the program is the same as a kid who comes occasionally. Those of you that are out there in the world know there's a lot of variation in involvement, and we shouldn't be using such crude measurement techniques. And we know, yes, the first step is to get them there, but getting them there is not enough. And we know that getting them there is the first part of the problem, but that's not going to lead you to outcomes necessarily. Then my colleague Jody Roth did a recent meta-analysis, and combining studies. When you look at it, the message of the meta-analysis is attendance doesn't matter. Do you want to go to a funder and say attendance in an after-school program doesn't matter? So when you look deeper in the data, she says, well, it does matter, but it matters depending on the amount. So it only matters when you're really highly intensity. And it matters on the quality, and I come out of the engagement field, so when you're engaged in a program, and it matters depending on the characteristics of the program. I think my colleagues will look at the characteristic questions, but I'm really starting at the first level of involvement. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 different ways to measure participation, but I'm going to mostly focus on engagement because I don't have that much time. I'll point you, if you're interested in this topic, my colleague Amy Bonard and I wrote a review of Ed Researcher on how different ways to measure organized activity participation, where we go into a lot of depth on these 4 levels. So at this point, I just want to kind of scratch the surface on the first 3. Intensity in terms of the frequency, duration is a history measure, breadth is, both the involvement within an activity. You can do a lot of different things, but let's get real. Kids do a lot of things with their after-school time. How does this program fit with others? And then engagement is a measure of the quality. Now, why should we do these? Because if you look at indicators, there's a lot of variation on all these indicators in use level. Also, programs are doing a lot of different things, and they're marketing themselves as they're doing a lot of different things. So we need to understand what kids are actually participating in, which types of programs, and why. So I'm just briefly going to talk about the first 3, and then I'm going to focus on engagement, because I'm going to argue that engagement is the most important and the least we know about. Okay. So in intensity, it's the most common measure. There's a variety of ways. There are often survey kind of measures, 1 to 7, 1 to 5 scales, or you ask the youth to report. There's pros and cons to each. We get into a lot of detail in that paper about measurement issues, so I don't really want to bore you here. Okay, but why? Why might you want to measure intensity? If you're interested in skill building, and Charles is going to talk about that, it takes time to build skills, and it takes time to build relationships. So you better look at how frequent and intense. If your program is about skills, you need to really get into that. The issue of time, it's more. If you're in a structured program, there's less time to be involved in risk. So we really need to know how long are kids actually in these programs. And then the question of overscheduled, I've written on this and others. I think that's more, for a small percentage of population may be true. It's more a myth than that. But we still need to counter that argument, have to have good data on what youth are actually doing with their time. Okay, duration. There's a variety of ways to measure duration in the history of involvement, and we don't have, there's a few exceptions, but we don't have good studies on the effects over time. And it takes time to develop relationships. And I'm really interested in the question in drop-off in participation. So if you really want to understand that, you have to follow youth, especially over this transition. So what kind of youth continues to participate? What are the skills, and do they gain from looking over time? And you really have to look at a duration measure. Okay, breath. In after-school programs, we don't have a lot of good measures of breath. I've also written on extracurriculars. There is more on breath in kind of that field than the program field. But the notion that kids, especially as we're looking at older kids, have a lot of things they could do with their after-school time. And you need to figure out how participating in this program fits with others. We also know that there's a lot of things that kids can do within an after-school program, and you need to know what, participating in academics versus recreational in these more comprehensive programs. So breath has only been measured in the after-school literature within a program. I think we need to kind of go beyond that. But they either group by type of activity, so assumption that different types of activities have different affordances, the number of activities, or the percentage of time you spend in each activity. And each of those has their own set of problems, but if you really care about this stuff, you can read my other paper. Okay? Which I think you should. But okay, so why measure breath? The reality is after-school programs, especially comprehensive type programs, are providing a range of unstructured and structured activities, and we know from some of the engagement literature that there is variation in how engaged youth are across these different contexts. So it's really important to measure this variation. Different activities are providing different developmental affordances. We know from Reed's and David Hansen's and some of that work that you're going to get something different from a sports activity than you are from an academic. So we need to understand that. And then youth are saying why they come is a range of activities, but we're not really measuring that. So I want to argue that really breath is really important. If you're a program that has to say, sees a drop-off in participation, and youth are going to another activity, to make that case, you have to say, well, what is it about, their breadth of involvement? Okay. And now I want to focus on engagement, which is the least studied of all of these, but I and others have argued the most important indicator to really get at these aspects. I and Jody and others have said, well, this might help to explain these mixed attendance findings. Some studies show very good outcomes. Others don't, and some are mixed. And when you put them together, you're going to get a really mixed bag. And then what's engagement is different than these three other outcomes. The three other outcomes are participation, behavioral measure. Now, behavior is important, but behavior is not everything. Engagement is multidimensional. So engagement, I come out of the school literature, and so we think of engagement as cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. So it's a really multidimensional construct. Okay, so why? When we look at studies that engagement, when they measure engagement in activities, it's linked to higher grades, higher achievement test scores, things that people care about. So if you can really get an engagement, it can help look at some of these outcomes. We also know there's a lot of variation in engagement, both across contexts. So one of the reasons I like out-of-school activities, and I think many of you do, is I also come in the school world, not a particularly engaging place. But out-of-school activities are. Reed's research and others have shown that this is the most engaging activity for youth. So, okay, so we know across contexts, but even within a context, there's big variation. So youth report being more engaged when they're doing recreation, when they're doing arts, than when they're doing homework. What do we start many programs with? Homework. Okay, so it has a question in terms of program design, and those kids who leave at 4:30 and 5 are only getting homework, and what does that mean? And then individuals vary, engagement ebbs and flows, so understanding why that happens. Then engagement is a big aspect of program quality. So if we want to, get youth and keep youth, it's about creating an engaging program. Okay, so what we did, and this is in an article that's coming out in an issue of New Directions in Youth Development that I think some of you are also contributing. We reviewed all of the literature on how people measured engagement. We looked at both peer-reviewed sources, and we looked at publications, we looked at websites, we looked at any kind of resource we could find. And what we found is there's not a lot out there, okay, message one, but it's defined and measured very differently across studies, and practitioners and researchers think of engagement quite differently. And you think of engagement, it's measured at the individual level. So what's that individual child's engagement in that setting, and how does it vary across time? And the program level, is this an overall engaging program? And I'm happy to share that and send that to anyone who's interested. Okay, so according to researchers, it's really thought of it as this is a very subjective individual state that varies across time. And many researchers have drawn on this school engagement notion of thinking about it as a multidimensional construct. So behavior, participation, effort, conduct, on-task behavior, affect, you know, your positive and negative relations with adults, how you feel in that setting, and then cognition, which is this like deeper kind of investment in learning. Okay, now practitioners tend to think of engagement more in terms of aspects of program quality. So if the youth is engaged, the quality of programming is high. And Charles, I think we'll talk more about this, and I think he has the most comprehensive really measure of engagement and thinking about engagement. We saw that in the prior slide, that engagement is the highest aspect of program quality. Now, I think both of these conceptions of engagement are important. People are coming from different perspectives. The practitioner has to get the youth there, has to think about how to keep them there and having an engaging program. The researcher is often thinking about is, who is this program most beneficial for and why and under what situation, so it's a much more individual focus. But we need to come to some commonality about how we think about it. Okay, these are some, I see Tom is up there, that we found 5 examples of self-report measures of engagement. Now they measure it quite differently. We have items about interest, enjoyment, concentration, perceptions of value, and challenge. We didn't find any 2 scales that were the same. And these scales, I think Tom would agree, they're the first step. It's, this, but they're limited. We have 1 item of this and 1 item of that. We're talking about 3 to 4 item scales. We also found 1 staff report item that Joe Mahoney did, where the program staff were asked to report on the level of engagement within, each youth in their program. Okay, so I come out of the survey literature. I think surveys have a lot of benefits. I think they can be quite useful in terms of being cost-effective, practical, a quick way to get engagement. Now, I would argue what programs tend to do is measure engagement once. You should measure, these are very general measures. So you have to, if you're going to take a survey approach, you have to measure engagement at multiple times because it changes over time. The problems with surveys, at least in this field, is, much of the after-school literature, we're talking about kids that are under 3rd grade. Surveys don't work so good with that age group, so, that's not always the best methodology. We also have the studies have very limited information on validity. So do these actually measure what they're supposed to measure? Do they relate to anything? I would say the field is really, these are the first set of studies, but we don't know much about the validity of these scales. And no scale includes items for all 3 dimensions. Now, I come out of the school engagement literature, and I've done a big review of measures of school engagement. There's a lot of problems with those, too. But the field is a lot farther along, and I think the out-of-school field could gain by really looking at some of these measures. I mean, there's differences between school and out-of-school, but the field is farther than we are. Okay, experience sampling techniques. Now, this is a way researchers have tended to measure engagement, but, they have a youth wear a wristwatch, a beeper. Rita's done a lot of this, and they're signaled either during a program or throughout the day. When they're single, they report on, how a variety of dimensions, one of which is engagement. And the engagement scales really look at level of interest, enjoyment, and concentration. Okay. Why I like experience sampling measures is it's really in the moment. So rather than asking you, how engaged were you? How much did you like? Retrospective is problematic. We also can look across time and situations. That's where why we know that engagement varies so much. That said, and I'm going to talk about what I think, programs should do. I really think there's a big feasibility issue of whether this really could do with a program level. It's a much harder way. It's a larger time investment. It can be costly to do. But there are some reasons why you might want to collect data in this way. Okay, then we have a lot of observational measures, and most of these are looking at global measures. So how engaged is a program? Engagement often a scale of many, so they look at different dimensions, and one scale is engagement. I just give 2 examples on here of observational measures at the program level. And I'm not sure if Neil's going to talk, at all about the observational data, but in an evaluation of 21st century programs, they looked at some of this observational measures, and engagement was one of them. Then there's a lot, and I don't have time to go in our paper, we go through, we dig deep and look at these different measures and say, you know, what are the pros and cons of these different measures, different ways of really looking at engagement. But there's a lot of good tools out there that have been used by programs to look at engagement. If you look at the actual scales, again, they're kind of all over the place, but we have on-task, off-task behavior. So this versus some of the surveys, we really have a behavioral measure, participation, focus, interest, respect, how you interact with others. So putting a lot of different things in for engagement. Okay. Why might you want to think about engagement in this level? Many of these are online, they're accessible, some of them are free, others you have to pay for, but you know, there's training, there's kind of, you know, get the programmatic assistance, which is really quite useful. What I like is you can really use them as a reflection. Assessment can be good, you know, to think about, you know, I mean, your practice and where does engagement fit within program quality. The problem with observations is they give a snapshot for a given day and a given number of attendees, so you've got to collect a lot of data. And if you're doing a program, you know, a lot of adolescent programs, you have more variability in programming, so that's, you know, that is an issue. Also, I found very little information on the validity. You know, so what do these lead to? So what are these engagement measures predicting to? And reliability. And reliability is an issue. If I observed it, would you find the same thing as somebody else observing? Observations are hard to do. And they can be more difficult to administer. There's a lot of technical assistance to help programs, but that's an issue with observation. Okay, so, you know, my 2 cents worth. If I can convince you of one thing, we can't do attendance anymore. It's not a compelling story, and, you know, we're gonna have trouble making the case if it's just about attendance. That said, and if you're a researcher, you collect data on all of these things, or you try to. In practice, you know, and if you can, that's the best thing to do, but thinking about how does that indicator match your goal? So if you're about skill development, I hope you're collecting data on intensity. If you're trying to show that your program, why there's a drop-off, you know, or why, you know, or you're a comprehensive program, I hope you're collecting data on breadth. So anytime there's variation, what youth could be participating in. And I would argue for every program, I hope you collect data on engagement, because that's the only case you're really going to show that the program matters. In terms of measuring engagement, I think the school field is true. This is true of the school field too, but I think especially the out-of-school field, what do we mean by engagement, and come to some common knowledge of what it is, and some, you know, I would love someone to develop a measure, like we have in the school literature, I could tell you the 4 measures that everybody uses. Now, I could also tell you what's wrong with each 4 of them, but at least everybody is using, you know, there's some commonality. And then finally, you know, there has to be much more reliability and validity testing of these measures, or the field isn't going to move forward. Thanks.